It's November 1983, and there is a group of teenagers who come in contact with another teenage girl their age who had escaped from a nearby lab. The lab performed tests on this teenager, such as mind control and things of the like. This teenager's mother had undergone testing that was similar to that of MK Ultra. The girl had abilities that were unlike anything the group of teenagers had ever seen. All of a sudden, they found themselves fighting for their lives, the lives of their loved ones, and people around them. They were not just fighting the government lab, but also beings and things from other dimensions. This is the beginning of the hit TV show Stranger Things, in case you've never watched it. What if I told you that some of the things within the series are references to actual conspiracy theories? The Duffer Brothers, who are the writers behind Stranger Things, have stated that some inspiration for the show had come from a conspiracy theory called the Montauk Project, and that the tests that were run on Eleven's mother were that of the actual CIA program called MK Ultra. The Montauk Project is a conspiracy theory, well, depending on who you ask, that claims the US government conducted testing and development of psychological warfare techniques along with time travel. According to Preston Nichols, who I guess you can say was a whistleblower if all of this is in fact true, but in his book he talked about the government allegedly kidnapping children, especially those with psychic abilities, using electromagnetic frequencies to enhance telepathic powers, conducting time travel experiments through the Montauk chair, opened portals to other dimensions, and encountered non-human entities, along with creating mind control programs that were so powerful they could erase memories or program assassins. All of this allegedly happened at Camp Hero, also known as Montauk Air Force Station in Montauk, New York. Let's put on our tinfoil hats and dive into the conspiracy theories behind Camp Hero, MK Ultra, the Philadelphia experiment, and the Montauk Project. And as Peter Moon said in the editorial notes of Preston Nichols' book, quote, "While it is indeed healthy to remain skeptical, it is equally healthy to keep an open mind," end quote. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. It has been quite a bit, but this video has taken me so much time to research and so many rabbit holes, along with I read a few different books about this whole entire topic. And yeah, so that's why this is actually a two-part series. But this was supposed to be part of my Spooktober series, which if you've been here for the past 5 years, I think is when I started it. It's supposed to be the spooky season videos, but I'm clearly very, very late to the party on that one. But I will leave a link to all of my Spooktober videos in the description box below. The reason why I wanted to go over this, I've actually wanted to cover this topic for quite a few years now because I'm a huge Stranger Things fan, but I just never really got around to it. And I figured with the last season, by the time that I post this video, probably the last season will have already started. And I figured that if there was any more perfect of a time to do this, it would be now. For legal purposes, I do have to say that all of this is alleged. And if I get anything wrong or miss something, please leave it in the comment section below, because there was something that kind of coincided with the Montauk Project, and that was the Montauk Boys, but I couldn't really find enough information to go ahead and make an entire section about it. So for those of you who know about the Montauk Project, I don't talk about that in this video. If I end up finding more information about it, I will go ahead and make a separate video that'll kind of go along with this series. But as I was saying, if I get anything wrong or miss something, please leave it in the comment section below, because there are so many rabbit holes to go down when it comes to some of the things that will be discussed in this two-part series. And there's also a lot of he said, she said type stuff as well. But with that said, I welcome any corrections to any part of this series or any information I may have not gone over. There will be chapters listed below, so you can go ahead and skip around, or if there's something that kind of piques your interest a little bit more than others, then all of that will be below. But anyway, without further ado, let's just get right into it. During present day, Camp Hero is actually a state park, which I can definitely see why, because I will post pictures and videos and stuff throughout this video, but it is absolutely beautiful when I see all the pictures and the videos, so I can definitely see why it was turned into a state park. However, it wasn't always just a beautiful park. In the 1940s, Montauk was disguised as a small fishing village, but it was first commissioned by the U.S. Army in 1942 as a coastal defense station. Quote, 3 gun batteries, 2 with two 16-inch guns and 1 with 2-inch guns, were installed at Camp Hero to defend New York against a possible attack by German ships and submarines. The enormous concrete batteries are closed to visitors and tightly sealed. They seem to recede into their respective hillsides, vines creeping up, nature slowly reclaiming what was built here without its permission. Someone or something has scratched the words, "Stranger, help me," into the concrete. End quote. As already stated, the government was trying to disguise Camp Hero as a coastal fishing village. They would do this by designing the official military structures of the base and making them look like cottages, and the gym on the base was actually, it looked like a church. In 1947, the Army deactivated the base and removed its coastal artillery. Just a few years later, in 1951, Camp Hero would be transferred over to the Air Force, and this is when they would install that radar tower that you see in all of the pictures. The Air Force would remain active on Camp Hero until 1982, and due to the land being deemed environmentally important because of the ecosystems and the animal life and all of those kinds of things, it was donated to the National Park Service in 1984. The National Park Service transferred ownership to the New York State Parks Department, and the park had been opened to the public in 2002. However, residents have said that there's more than meets the eye when it comes to this place. Some people have noticed men in black, which is kind of the thing that you always hear when it comes to the government and the conspiracy theories and all of that kind of stuff, government cover-ups and all of that kind of stuff. So kind of like the government boogeyman, I would say. So you hear a lot of stories about the men in black, or like I just said, the government boogeyman. They've talked about these men in black entering underground tunnels, how there's been weird activity and just kind of weird vibrations, meaning like strange sounds vibrating. And there was this one story that I found on Reddit. Now, I know it's Reddit, so I understand that you can question the validity of this, and I understand, again, it's just a he said, she said thing, but I thought it was interesting, and I think that we should go ahead and read this story. So let me just pull it up real quick, because I mean, if we're talking about all these conspiracy theories and everything, I think we should go over some of the first-hand accounts, if you will. So I'm obviously going to go ahead and put the Reddit post up on the screen, but the title of it, it says, "Credibility of Preston Nichols and Al Bielek. What are your thoughts on the claims of these two men who claim to have seen the future, etc.? I personally found their claims rather far-fetched." I decided to scroll down and kind of read the comments and everything, and one person posted this really interesting story, and it said, "Back in 2019, I had a very strange encounter on Montauk Highway right outside Camp Hero. At the time, I didn't know the significance of that place. My brother and I had just driven our 74 Beetle we just finished restoring out to Montauk Lighthouse. We stopped to make some adjustments as my brother was under the car. I had the rear hatch open, and out of nowhere, this guy pops up and goes, 'Oh good, you found the motor.' Dumb rear engine joke in the Beetle community. Literally everyone goes, the motor's in the back when you have the front hatch open." This is really off topic, but yes, I actually do know that. My uncle had a really old Volkswagen, like I said, off topic, in Poland, and yeah, the motor is in the back. Anyway, keep in mind Montauk Highway is kind of desolate in areas, one road in and out, not much around besides the woods and dunes. This guy pulls out a wad of cash, and I distinctly remember because he had all old bills that aren't in circulation anymore. He says, "Put your hand out," and starts placing $5 bills in my hand while telling me about how he's an engineer and he used to work for all these big tech companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin. And he says, "If anyone asks, I'm paying you for your time as a contractor, so you are not liable." He goes on to say he's being watched right now by men in a van. I was half paying attention, but when he said that, I looked down the road, which was previously deserted, and there was a black van parked down the road about 40 yards away with dudes watching us. At this point, he had my full attention. He quickly goes, get in alignment, and check your fan belt, and saunters off into the distance at the same time that van pulls a U-turn and starts following the dude. My brother then comes out from under the car just as confused as I am, with $35 in my hand, and I turn around to show my brother who I was talking to, and they're gone. No van, no man. We even drove in that direction, but no luck. Fast forward to now, I see a video on Insta about Stranger Things and the Montauk Project, and an image flashes of Preston Nichols on his book. I shit you not, that is the man that approached me. I've wondered about this encounter for years and feel confident that was who I was talking to. I recognize his whole body shape right down to his eyes and face. I realize that the internet says he passed away in 2018, but I don't know what else to say. So, again, you know, this is all the weird conspiracy theories and stuff like that. But I thought it was interesting. I know to keep an open mind, and I know that some of this is like the spooky ghost stories that you tell each other or stuff like that. And I mean, it's Reddit, so this could easily be someone that just came on there and came up with a really creative story, and they have a very active imagination. But I still find it kind of interesting because it can be real. I mean, how do we know that it's not real? We don't know that it is, but we also don't know that it's not. So, and I mean, some people may argue, oh, well, he passed away and before this person even saw him, blah, blah, blah. But then we kind of get into the world of the paranormal. Again, some people believe it, some people don't. So, you know, it's kind of one of those weird things.
So that people can actually have parallel lifetimes going on.
Well, time is essentially like a real estate. In other words, as you and I can walk through real estate from point A to point B, all time coexists, and it's possible to go from point A to point B if you can find the path to go directly from. Some people believe it's taking the linear timeline, bending it over next to each other and creating a wormhole or a punch through from time A to time B.
And so when you're existing you're at the same time, literally, like, you know, you can fold it over and wow, here I am. What about creating alternate paths then? Are we doing that with our lives because of that ability for time to sort of warp or fold over on itself?
Some of us are doing multiple timelines if we have the capability of going from, let's say, today to 2 weeks ago and working the whole 2 weeks over again. What will happen is the first pass will become an alternate reality. Good morning, people. You already know who I am. I think we'll say at this point that our purpose here is not to prove whether or not this project happened. What we are here is to discuss what they did, how they did it. Mr. Bielek already discussed very well what they did. So we'll go into the meat of it. Essentially, the Montauk Project was a very large mind amplifier. That's essentially all it was. I have here a very simplified block diagram.
You get back up on the platform and get you.
Well, the trouble is I'm having trouble seeing the diagram.
Okay, go ahead.
I can be right here. All right. Very simplified, was essentially a transmitter. We had an input network, which was the Montauk chair, that's what we called it. Mr. Cameron, sitting over there in the red shirt, was the psychic that sat in the Montauk chair and fed information into the computer system. The computer system essentially processed the information and spit it out the transmitter. We had two transmitters, drove one of two antennas. There was also a Delta T antenna and a 100 kilowatt noise amplifier. This was the basic outlay of the Montauk system.
Experiments, things from his experiments, and as many of you know, Preston Nichols is the scientist from the Montauk Project, and he was the one that was operating the trip chair.
I eventually found myself working out at Montauk Point through Brookhaven National Laboratories on Long Island, and found myself on this screwball project, which was known as Project Red Hawk, was the actual name, but it's popularly become called the Montauk Project, which started with the early stealth you would know as the Philadelphia experiment. We developed the electromagnetic bottle to hide any sort of a ship in. Up to that point, it was thought that the mind of man had no sensitivity to electromagnetics, which everyone learned quite to their mistake. Yeah, the mind of man is quite sensitive to electromagnetics. And from there, research was done, which I was involved with, of how to interface the mind of man to electromagnetic systems. The idea was you could fly your fighter plane by thought. Pure thought would fly the plane or drive the ship. But it evolved into essentially a mind control device, which is what they were really looking for. They wanted to be able to feed a program into an early computer, flip a switch, and everybody would respond to it. That was what they wanted. They never got that. But never could find a like a universal psychic signature for all humans. You would have to target each person individually. The individual targeting worked very well. Then it was discovered that since basically the project was nothing but a mind amplifier, that's all it was a mind amplifier. If the person in the input network could think of other times and fully flesh out the time in his head, this machine had the capability of generating that time, generating a vortex, different space and time. And that's what the Montauk Project eventually evolved into, a time machine.
I have an entire video that is dedicated to mostly just talking about the Montauk Project. But before we get into everything, because everything else in this video kind of ties into the Montauk Project, it's all related to one another, I have to give at least a little bit of a background, but the nitty-gritty information will be in the next part of the series. I know that I already said this in the intro, but depending on who you talk to, some people might say that this is just a far-fetched conspiracy theory, and some people will say, no, this is 100% real. And then you'll also have people that say, it could be either or. And that's kind of where I fall, is I'm kind of in the either or, because I mean, in my opinion, for legal purposes, this is all my opinion. I don't want to get sued and I don't need the government coming after me. But in my opinion, because of the government's history and because of things like MK Ultra, I mean, it might seem a little far-fetched, but at the same time, I think some of you get what I'm trying to say. On page 11 of Preston Nichols' book, he stated, quote, "Some of the data you will read in this book can be considered soft facts. Soft facts are not untrue. They are just not backed up by irrefutable documentation. A hard fact would be documentation or hard physical evidence that could stand up to scrutiny. By the nature of the subject matter and security considerations, hard facts about the Montauk Project have been very difficult to obtain. There is also an area between soft and hard which can be termed gray facts. These would be very plausible, but not as easily provable as a hard fact. Any serious investigation will show that a Montauk Project did in fact exist," end quote. He did also continue saying in the book that it's not there to prove anything, it's just to get the story out there, and that it's being presented as non-fiction as it contains no falsehoods to the knowledge of the authors, but depending on what is suitable for the reader, it can also be read as science fiction. Peter Moon, whose real name is Vincent Barbaric, did add his commentary to the version of the book that I actually have, and he stated that this is, quote, "as applicable today as it was when it was written. I would add, however, that Preston Nichols has always tried to avoid hard facts as stated above, not because they do not exist, but rather because, per his statement, he is afraid to prove the Montauk Project for fear of his life. While I believe his fears are past due to the time that has passed since his employment in the defense industry, it does not behoove myself nor anyone else to overlook the trauma he experienced and how this might affect his decision making, end quote. Now that we got all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and just touch base on a very brief overview of the story that inspired Stranger Things. According to Wikipedia, they state, quote, "The Montauk Project is a conspiracy theory that alleges there were a series of United States government projects conducted at Camp Hero or Montauk Air Force Station in Montauk, New York, for the purpose of developing psychological warfare techniques and exotic research, including time travel. The story of the Montauk Project originated in the Montauk Project series of books by Preston Nichols, which intermixes those stories with stories about the Bulgarian experiment," end quote. Now, you can call me a conspiracy theorist or whatever, but I do believe that there are definitely things we don't know about when it comes to the government, and some of these conspiracy theories may have some truth to them. It may not be exactly the way it's been told to the public, but some things are pretty damn believable. Not to mention, it's believed that the Montauk Project was a continuation of MK Ultra, but more underground, as in off the books, a bit more dangerous, and just overall worse than MK Ultra. Now, if you don't know anything about MK Ultra, that is actually the next section of this video, so we will go over it. But if you know a little bit about it, there's a little tidbit that I want to mention here. There were also documents that were destroyed in the process of when everything was kind of ending with MK Ultra. So who's to say that maybe, and again, this is just an opinion, but who's to say that the Montauk Project didn't exist? Because what if it's just like MK Ultra where the documents were destroyed? And if the Montauk Project is a continuation of MK Ultra, well, allegedly that's what's been claimed. But if it is a continuation, maybe they would have learned their lessons, so to speak, from the first round. But again, call me a conspiracy theorist, but I'm just playing devil's advocate here. If you don't know what MK Ultra is, I kind of touched base on this in my video about the arcade game Polybius that I made a few years ago that was part of my Spooktober series. But let's go over what MK Ultra is now. If you haven't been around my channel since, I guess you could kind of say the very beginning, but since my anti-multi-level marketing days, or also referred to as anti-MLM days, you may not know that something I talked a lot about on my channel for a very long time was that of cults and being indoctrinated into cults and commercial cults, things of the like. There's also thought reform, so Lifton's thought reform theory, along with the BITE model by Stephen Hanson, who based the BITE model off of the theory and research of Margaret Singer, Edgar Schein, Louis Jorlin West, and others who studied brainwashing in China, as well as cognitive dissonance theory by Leon Festinger. I say all of this because some of our military back in the day is what seems to have kind of started the whole thing behind MK Ultra. Hey everyone, Editing Monica here. I just wanted to say that I was pronouncing Alan Dulles' name incorrectly throughout this portion of the video, and I know that it's Dulles. I'm not sure why. Maybe I just got it into my head and then I just kept saying it over and over again, but I'm very well aware that it's Alan Dulles, not Alan Dulles. So whenever I say Dulles, that's who I'm referring to, Alan Dulles. Anyway, back to the video. Quote, "On April 10th, 1953, Alan Dulles, the newly appointed director of the CIA, delivered a speech to a gathering of Princeton alumni. Though the event was mundane, global tensions were running high. The Korean War was coming to an end, and earlier that week, the New York Times had published a starting story asserting the American POWs returning from the country may have been converted by communist brainwashers. Some GIs were confessing to war crimes like carrying out germ warfare against the communists, a charge the U.S. categorically denied. Others were reportedly so brainwashed that they had refused to return to the United States at all. As if that weren't enough, the U.S. was weeks away from secretly sponsoring the overthrow of a democratically elected leader in Iran. Dulles had just become the first civilian director of an agency growing more powerful by the day, and the speech provided an early glimpse into his priorities for the CIA. In the past few years, we have become accustomed to hearing much about the battle for men's minds, the war of ideologies, he told the attendees. I wonder, however, whether we clearly perceive the magnitude of the problem, whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become in Soviet hands, he continued. We might call it, in its new form, brain warfare, end quote. Alan Dulles did say the techniques the Soviets used were abhorrent and nefarious. As you can probably imagine, news spread about all of these brainwashing techniques in the 1950s, and paranoia started to sink in with the general public. Enter in MK Ultra. A little side note, or more so just an opinion of mine, I do believe that mind control has been something governments have looked into way before the Soviets and way before MK Ultra. I just think that Alan took what was happening and was able to spin it to be able to start experiments like MK Ultra. That's my opinion though, so don't take that as a fact, obviously. Quote, 3 days after his speech decrying Soviet tactics, Dulles approved the beginning of MK Ultra, a top-secret CIA program for covert use of biological and chemical materials. American values made for good rhetoric, but Dulles had far grander plans for the agency's Cold War agenda. MK Ultra's mind control experiments generally centered around behavior modification via electroshock therapy, hypnosis, polygraphs, radiation, and a variety of drugs, toxins, and chemicals. These experiments relied on a range of test subjects, some who freely volunteered, some who volunteered under coercion, and some who had absolutely no idea they were involved in a sweeping defense research program. From mentally impaired boys at state school to American soldiers to sexual psychopaths at a state hospital. MK Ultra's programs often preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. The CIA considered prisoners especially good subjects as they were willing to give consent in exchange for extra recreation time or commuted sentences, end quote. Now, most of you watching or listening, if not all of you, have heard of the drug LSD. This was part of MK Ultra. But how did the CIA come up with this idea to use LSD? That would be because in the late 1940s, the CIA found out the Soviet Union had been trying to produce LSD, and they attempted to purchase the world's supply of the chemical. One CIA officer stated that the CIA was terrified of the use of LSD in the Soviets' program because of the lack of knowledge about the drug in the United States. Quote, this was the one material that we had ever been able to locate that really had potential fantastic possibilities if used wrongly, end quote. Even with these concerns, on November 18, 1953, 10 scientists would meet at a cabin in the woods of Maryland, which doesn't seem sketchy whatsoever, and that's obviously sarcasm. But after they had spoken for a bit, they decided that in order to understand the value of LSD, quote, an unwitting experiment would be desirable, end quote. So yeah, let's go ahead and use LSD on some people without their consent and see if we can brainwash them into doing the things we want them to, for the sake of science. Now, I do have to say that some people voluntarily took the LSD for the experiment, but a lot of them did it without consent. What's sad is that when I go over some of the victims of these experiments, one of them was part of the experiment for a majority of her pregnancy. They also knew she was pregnant, which is absolutely abhorrent. Because the CIA knew how the public would react to MK Ultra, their methods, and the fact that no one consented to this, well, except for the people that voluntarily took the LSD, which was a very small percentage, but they knew that they had to keep this very hush-hush. Oh, the government hiding things from the public? Big surprise. Well, in my opinion, of course. Quote, precautions must be taken not only to protect operations from exposure to enemy forces, but also to conceal these activities from the American public in general. The knowledge that the agency is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles and would be detrimental to the accomplishment of its mission, end quote. As I just went over, the CIA would give LSD to unsuspecting individuals, and sometimes they could find volunteers, but they even slipped the drug into some of the drinks of CIA employees. The LSD experiments would get more and more extensive over time. And this is where I'm going to talk about one of the most notorious of the experiments, and that would be Operation Midnight Climax. According to one source, quote, in 1955, on 225 Chestnut Street, San Francisco, the CIA was devoting substantial attention to decorating a bedroom. George White oversaw the interior renovations. Not much of a decorator, White had a storied career in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. When the CIA moved into drug experiments, bringing White on board became a top priority. White hung up pictures of French can-can dancers and flowers. He draped lush red bedroom curtains over the windows. He framed a series of posters with black silk mats for a middle-aged drug bureaucrat. Each item evoked sex and glamour. George White wasn't building a normal bedroom. He was building a trap. White then hired a Berkeley engineering student to install bugging equipment and a two-way mirror. White sat behind the mirror, martini in hand, and waited for the action to begin. Sex workers would lure unsuspecting Johns to the bedroom, where the men would be dosed with LSD and their actions observed by White from beyond the mirror. As payment for their services, the sex workers received small amounts of cash, as well as a guarantee from White that he'd intercede when the women inevitably had run-ins with law enforcement in the future, end quote. Now, there was an end or dismantling of MK Ultra, but as I've already said in this video, unfortunately, documents were destroyed, and we're really relying mostly on personal accounts, along with just, there's a few documents that kind of made it through, but yeah, most of the documents were destroyed. The experiments with the LSD did continue into 1963, and then in the spring of 1963, John Vance, who was a member of the CIA Inspector General staff, found out about MK Ultra. The directors of MK Ultra tried to get the CIA's audit board to let them continue on with the research. Fast forward to 1977, quote, Senator Edward Kennedy oversaw congressional hearings investigating the effects of MK Ultra. Congress brought in a roster of ex-CIA employees for questioning, interrogating them about who oversaw these programs, how participants were identified, and if any of these programs had been continued. The hearings turned over a number of disturbing details, particularly about the 1953 suicide of Dr. Frank Olson, an Army scientist who jumped out of a hotel window several days after unwittingly consuming a drink spiked with LSD. Amid growing criminalization of drug users, and just a few years after President Nixon declared the drug abuse as the public enemy number one, the ironies of the United States' troubling experimentation with drugs appeared in sharp relief. But throughout the hearings, Congress kept hitting roadblocks. CIA staffers claimed they couldn't remember details about many of the human experimentation projects or even the number of people involved. The obvious next step would be to consult the records, but that presented a small problem. In 1973, amid mounting inquiries, the director of MK Ultra told workers it would be a good idea if the files were destroyed, citing vague concerns about the privacy and embarrassment of participants. The men who crafted MK Ultra effectively eradicated the paper record for one of the United States' most obviously illegal undertakings. A program born in secrecy would hold on to so many secrets forever, end quote. Not to be too blunt, but what in the actual fuck? But seriously, the fact that they tried to cover it up and say that they're doing it because of some of the embarrassing details, no. That's not why you did it. You did it so that you wouldn't get caught. You did it so that the public wouldn't find out about what the government was allegedly doing to people without their consent. I also slightly call bullshit on not remembering things and not remembering the experiments, because if you were part of this program and if you were doing some of these experiments, how did you not remember? You might not remember the details of every single person, of every single thing that was done to said person, but how do you not remember at least parts of it? There have been a number of victims who have come forward and talked about their experience with MK Ultra and all of what was done to them. Maybe not all of it, because obviously they were drugged for some of it, but they were able to come forward and tell parts of their story. But there have also been a lot of articles written about it and things of that nature. Esther's story is one that really made me incredibly emotional because she was tested on while she was pregnant, and the doctor knew that she was pregnant. The reasoning behind them testing her while she was pregnant was to treat her anxiety during pregnancy, and as someone who suffered from that along with postpartum anxiety, the state of vulnerability that you are in is so upsetting, and I could not imagine going to a doctor hoping to get better. Meanwhile, I'm a victim to an experiment that I didn't consent to. Let's start from the beginning though, so I can give a little more detail to Esther's story. Esther's childhood was anything but easy. Both of her parents passed away at an early age, and Esther was 4 years old when her father passed in 1936, and a year later, her mother had been diagnosed with a brain tumor. The sad part was, in order to treat the brain tumor, her mother was given a lobotomy. Due to the lobotomy, her mother was not fit to take care of Esther and her older brother. In the end, her mother was committed to a psychiatric institution. And the story only gets worse. Esther and her brother moved around from relatives' homes to foster homes and had suffered wherever they were placed. Eventually, Esther decided in her late teens that she was going to train as a nurse and landed a job at the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal. That time in her life would be when she would meet Esther Schrier on a blind date, and little did she know he would become her future husband in 1955. 3 years after they were married, Esther gave birth to their first child, Lynn Carroll. Sadly, Lynn would pass away at just 3 weeks old due to a staph infection. Medical records did show that she felt responsible for her daughter's death, and I really feel for Esther, and she had gone through so much in her life up until this point that I cannot fathom how she was doing mentally. 2 years after her daughter's death, she became pregnant again. However, she was still processing what had happened and was still feeling responsible and guilty for her daughter's death. Her medical records indicated that she had anxiety over possibly losing another baby. While I was pregnant, I had anxiety the entire pregnancy that something bad would happen. That's why I didn't announce my pregnancy until I couldn't hide it anymore. Anyway, I say all of this to say I understand anxiety during pregnancy, even though it's not because of Esther's reason, but the fear and feeling causing the anxiety is something I'm familiar with. One day, Haskell, Esther's husband, read an article about Dr. Ewan Cameron and the Allen's Hospital reputation when it came to the psychiatric care they offered. Dr. Cameron was a Scottish-born American psychiatrist, and he held different titles at different points in his life, such as director of the Allen Hospital, head of the Canadian and the American Psychiatric Associations, and the World Psychiatric Association. According to Lloyd Schreier, who was the baby Esther was pregnant with, yes, spoiler, he survived the experiments, and he stated that Dr. Cameron was, quote, godlike, end quote, which is a scary abuse of power that, as you will find, and I'm sure you've already assumed, he was in cahoots with the CIA and MK Ultra. 3 years after MK Ultra was launched, the CIA had approached Dr. Cameron after they had learned of his reputation. They had approached him through the Society of Investigation of Human Ecology, which was a research foundation and a front where the CIA funneled money according to one source. The CIA encouraged the doctor to apply for a grant, and from January 1957 to September 1960, he would receive $60,000, which in August of 2025, that would be worth a little over $700,000. I almost forgot to tell you why Dr. Cameron had quite the reputation. This was due to his psychiatric research, where he would use extreme sensory deprivation, drugs, and intense repetition via recorded messages. Of course, the CIA would want him to work for them during MK Ultra. Well, unknowingly, Esther Schrier would become a victim to MK Ultra and Dr. Cameron in February of 1960. Her and her family thought the care she would receive would help with her anxiety, not that she would turn into an unethical and inhumane experiment while pregnant. Sadly, she would start off by spending 30 days in the sleep room, which was where patients were put into a drug-induced coma. They would only have the patients wake up for 3 feedings and bathroom breaks per day. You would think that Esther, being pregnant, she would gain weight in a normal situation with no experiments, but since the beginning of her being in the sleep room, she had lost 13 pounds. In addition to that, she couldn't even stand up on her own because of how weak she was. It is abhorrent that this was all done while she was pregnant. It's also disgusting that these doctors and whoever else was performing these experiments were able to sleep at night knowing they were doing this to non-consenting human beings. After the sleep room, she went through a treatment, well, actually, let's call it what it is, an experiment called depatterning. Dr. Cameron did this depatterning method on patients in order to break their minds down to a childlike state. This was done through drugs and electroshock therapy. This way, he could basically wipe their brain and just reprogram them. Quote, part of his reprogramming regime would involve what he dubbed psychic driving, which meant playing recorded messages to the patients for up to 20 hours a day, whether they were asleep or awake. These voices were played through headphones, helmets, or speakers, sometimes installed right inside the patient's pillow. Records show some patients would hear these messages up to 500,000 times, end quote. Esther would be considered completely depatterned by March 12th of 1960, according to her medical records. This meant she was incontinent, mute, and even had trouble swallowing. The baby that she was pregnant with at the time did survive and at one point stated, quote, that's crazy to do that to a pregnant woman. When she woke from the sleep room, she didn't know who my father was. She didn't know it was her husband. I guess she didn't know anything. You know, she used to tell me she had to relearn everything, end quote. You might be wondering if she had any complications throughout any of this experimentation. And I mean, I'm surprised that the baby, her son Lloyd, actually made it out alive. I'm surprised she did as well. She did have some gynecological issues throughout these experiments, and they would have an OB come in and treat her. When this would happen, they would let her rest for 4 to 5 days. Oh, how so terribly nice of them. Obviously sarcasm. By August 17, 1960, only 6 months after she was admitted for what her and her family thought would be a normal treatment to help her, she had undergone 29 electroshock treatments, with them being of the extreme type. However, it stopped at that point because she had reached the 8th month of her pregnancy. So they had no problem doing this the entire time this fetus was developing inside of her. But, because she's at the 8-month mark, somehow that's when they said, okay, enough is enough. I did read up on Dr. Cameron, and what really angers me is that he went through life unscathed, and MK wasn't brought to light until after he died. I was hoping that maybe something would have been done against him, but he died before justice could be served. Lloyd was born on September 27, 1960, and by this point, Esther had felt helpless. She couldn't remember anything, let alone how to take care of a newborn baby. As someone who has experienced postpartum anxiety and depression, I can't imagine going through something like that, in addition to not even remembering how to function like a normal human being and having to relearn everything. Lloyd did state that she didn't even remember how to boil water. There was one picture I came across of Esther with her husband, and he was holding their baby. She just looked so lost, and you can tell that she wasn't okay. It's so heartbreaking to see that because her and her family truly thought she was getting the help she needed, when that was just not the case. Esther would go on to a BBC Scotland interview in 2004 and state, quote, I had a new baby, and I didn't know what to do with the baby. I had help, a baby nurse, but she had to have a day off and left me a book. And I'll just give you a little example from the book. When you hear the baby cry, go to the room, pick up baby, and step by step how to feed the baby. And that was very frightening, end quote. Esther died of cancer at 84 in 2017. Lloyd did state that Esther was able to live a full life. While Lloyd was not sure if any of the experiments did have an actual impact to his health, he said, quote, I think I was lucky. I think the only side effects that I know of, I guess in school, I was a bit slow in the beginning, but I ended up going through high school, and we have in Montreal's CEGEP. I did the 2 years, and then I went on to McGill, and I did a Bachelor of Commerce. So I was able to get my degrees and everything, but I will never know what I could have been, end quote. Many victims of Cameron did come out of the Allen completely broken and were not able to live their lives the way that they once did. The trauma that these experiments caused even ripped apart families and children. Canada never provided a list of victims during Dr. Cameron's reign of terror from 1943 to 1964. The government has never admitted liability or even apologized. Lloyd Schrier said, quote, "I think eventually they should come out with the truth. I think after all this time, I don't know what they're trying to prove, who they're trying to protect. I don't think it's right. I think they should come out and just, deal with it," end quote. Dr. Frank Olson, who was a member of MKUltra and turned into a victim of MKUltra as well. Frank Rudolph Emanuel Olson was born to Swedish immigrant parents in Wisconsin on July 10, 1910. He would go on to earn a bachelor's from the University of Wisconsin, and in 1983, he would earn a PhD in bacteriology. He ended up marrying one of his classmates by the name of Alice Smith Wicks, and they would have 3 children together. Frank Olson would enroll in the Reserve Officers Training Corps in order to help alleviate some of the cost he endured during his time in college. Frank worked at Purdue University's Agriculture Experimentation Station before being called to active duty. He was called to active duty at Fort Hood, Texas, and this was when the U.S. entered into World War II. In December of 1942, Frank would receive a call from Ira Baldwin, who would become the future mentor of Sidney Gottlieb, who would become the CIA's leading chemist and director of MKUltra. This call was Ira asking Frank if he'd like to join him in being part of a secret program regarding the development of biological weapons. Ira wanted Frank to become one of the first scientists in the program at what would be known as Fort Detrick. A few months later, the Chemical Corps took over Fort Detrick and the Biologicals Warfare Laboratories would be born. During this program, Frank would work with ex-Nazis who were brought into the country through Operation Paperclip. Fast forward to 1944, and Frank would be discharged from the Army, but would continue to work at Fort Detrick with a civilian contract. This was so he could continue with his research in aerobiology. Quote, in 1949, he joined many other Detrick scientists in Antigua for Operation Harness, which tested the vulnerability of different animals to toxic clouds. In 1950, he was a part of Operation Sea Spray, where the bacterium, I'm going to butcher this name, so I'm also going to put it up on the screen, but Serratia marcescens was released into the coastal mist of San Francisco through a minesweeper, reaching all of San Francisco's 800,000 residents, as well as people living in 8 surrounding cities. Olson traveled often to Fort Terry, a secret army base off Long Island, where toxins too deadly to be brought into the U.S. mainland were tested, end quote. In May of 1952, Frank also became part of the Committee for Project Artichoke, which was an experimental CIA interrogation program. Frank Olson's children stated that working at Fort Detrick had affected Frank very deeply. Frank had witnessed and even been a part of poisoning, gassing, and torturing lab animals. Frank's son Eric stated, quote, he'd come to work in the morning and see piles of dead monkeys. That messes with you. He wasn't the right guy for that, end quote. And I mean, I don't see how anyone could be the right guy for that job. Frank spent a decade at Fort Detrick. He would frequently travel to Germany to witness the interrogation sessions. The victims of these sessions would occasionally die from trauma due to the tactics they used. Frank was also one of the scientists who traveled to or through France during the summer of 1951. This was a summer that an entire village of Point Saint-Esprit was poisoned by a naturally occurring fungus that LSD was derived from. There was a semi-monthly retreat of men who were closest to MKUltra, and there was one scheduled at a cabin in Deep Creek Lake for Wednesday, November 18th to Friday, November 20th, 1953. There were 12 people who were on the list of men who would meet at the cabin: Frank Olson, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Ruitt, who was Frank's supervisor, John L. Schwab, John Stubbs, Benjamin Wilson, Herbert Burt Tanner, John C. Milanovsky, Gerald Yonetz, Sidney Gottlieb, Robert Lashbrook, A. Hughes, and Henry Bortner. Now, this might not come as a surprise, but on November 19th at around 7:30, Frank and some other men from this meeting were drugged with a potential truth serum, which many years later was found to be LSD. The next morning, Frank went back to Maryland. However, he was not the same Frank anymore. When he got home, he sat down for dinner with his family and he refused to eat. He seemed very distant and didn't really acknowledge his children. Frank had also told his wife that he made a terrible mistake. On November 23rd, Frank and his boss, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Ruett, made it to work at Fort Detrick, and they were both still not back to normal. According to Vincent Ruett, Frank seemed to be a little agitated, and Frank had asked if he should be fired or quit. Vincent was able to calm him down a bit, but Frank only got worse as the days went on. Frank was disoriented and felt weird about all of the work that he had been doing, along with feeling incompetent in his field. On Tuesday, November 24th, Frank went to work, but this time around, he somehow ended up at home before noon, and his coworker John Stubbs was with him. Frank told his wife that John Stubbs had come home with him because, quote, "they're afraid I might hurt you," end quote, which I'm sure could have been a bit unsettling for his wife. Frank also told her that he had agreed to undergo a psychiatric treatment of some sort. After this interaction, Frank Ruett and a CIA chemist named Robert Lashbrook flew to New York City to meet Harold Abramson, who was linked to the CIA as a medical doctor and had worked with Frank earlier on. 4 days later in New York City, on Saturday, November 28th, 1953, at around 2 a.m., while staying at the Statler Hilton Hotel, formerly known as Hotel Pennsylvania, Frank Olson jumped out of his window and landed on the sidewalk. The manager, who was working, ran to Frank, who somehow was still alive when he hit the pavement, and he stated that Frank tried to mumble something or tell him something, but unfortunately, Frank would pass away before medical help showed up. Here is where this whole situation gets even more sketchy than it already was, because I'm sure most of us who have our tinfoil hats on can agree that this is already a sketchy situation. However, many years later, the manager who found Frank on the sidewalk did say, quote, "In all of my years in the hotel business, I never encountered a case where someone got up in the middle of the night, ran across a dark room in his underwear, avoiding 2 beds, and dove through a closed window with the shade and curtains drawn," end quote. Now, to add to the sketchiness even more, that night after Frank had jumped to his death, when police went into the room where Frank was staying, they found Robert Lashbrook sitting on the toilet in the bathroom. In addition to all of this, the hotel's switchboard operator reported having connected a call from room 1018A to a number listed as belonging to Dr. Harold Abramson. According to the operator, who overheard the entirety of the brief call, the occupant in 1018A reported, "Well, he's gone," to which the call's recipient had replied, "Well, that's too bad," end quote. Excuse me, what? I would normally say something such as, why didn't the police investigate this further or try to get to the bottom of it? But I mean, how is New York City police going to investigate the CIA and hire government officials? Well, it only gets worse, and I think we can agree this is of no surprise. Quote, "At the scene and in their written report, the 2 police officers discussed similarities to the 1948 Lawrence Duggan case, in which a high-level government official suspected of espionage died after plummeting from his New York office. The ensuing police report said that on his last night in Manhattan, Olson purposely threw himself out of the window of his 10th floor hotel room at the Hotel Statler, which he had been sharing with Lashbrook, and died shortly after impact," end quote. Frank Olson's family never really got any details about Frank's death. All they knew was that he fell or jumped after suffering a fatal nervous breakdown. At least this was until the year 1975, because that is when the Rockefeller Commission exposed some of MK Ultra's activities. That was the same year that the government would admit to drugging Frank with LSD without his knowledge. Once the family stated that they planned to sue the CIA for Frank's wrongful death, the government offered an out-of-court settlement of $1.25 million, which they later decreased to $750,000, which they accepted. This $750,000 would be almost $7 million in September of 2025, according to the inflation calculator that I used. President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby did apologize to the family for the negligence of the CIA. There was a man by the name of Hunter White who had actually been, I guess you can say, Frank's handler during his stay in New York before he died. However, Hunter had to leave to take care of his sick mother, but after Hunter White had passed away, his wife decided she would donate all of his written information to Foothill College in 1977. The CIA had redacted many of the documents, but they also obtained many of them for use in the CIA's Victim Task Force, which was designed to reach settlements with victims of MKUltra. In 1994, Eric Olson, who was Frank's son, had his father's body exhumed so that he could be buried with his mother, and at this time, the family decided to have a second autopsy performed. This was because in the medical report after Frank Olson died, it stated that there were cuts and abrasions on the body, and there were many theories about Frank being allegedly assassinated instead of committing suicide. The second autopsy had shown that they weren't able to find cuts or abrasions that they were in the original report, but they did report that they found a large hematoma on the left side of Frank's head and a large injury on his chest. Most of the team that did this second autopsy decided that the blunt force trauma to the head and the injury to the chest did not occur during the fall, but most likely before the fall. The evidence concluded that Frank's death was, quote, wrinkly and starkly suggestive of homicide, end quote. Unfortunately, Frank Olson's family never found out the truth, and maybe even some of his family is still trying to find out.
I'm Christy Nicola, born July of 1962, rendering me 32 years of age. I was a subject in radiation as well as mind control and drug experiments performed by a man I knew as Dr. Green. My parents were divorced around 1966, and Donald Richard Ebner, my natural father, was involved with Dr. Green in the experiments. I was a subject from 1966 to 1976. Dr. Green performed radiation experiments on me in 1970, focusing on my neck, throat, and chest, 1972 focusing on my chest and my uterus in 1975. Each time I became dizzy, nauseous, and threw up. All these experiments were performed on me in conjunction with mind control techniques and drugs in Tucson, Arizona. Dr. Green was using me mostly as a mind control subject from 1966 to 1973. His objective was to gain control of my mind and train me to be a spy assassin. The first significant memory took place at Kansas City University in 1966. Don Ebner took me there by plane when my mom was out of town. I was in what looked like a laboratory, and there seemed to be other children. I was strapped down, naked, spread eagle, on a table, on my back. Dr. Green had electrodes on my body, including my head. He used what looked like an overhead projector and repeatedly said he was burning different images into my brain while a red light flashed aimed at my forehead. In between each sequence, he used electric shock on my body and told me to go deeper and deeper, while repeating each image would go deeper into my brain, and I would do whatever he told me to do. I felt drugged because he had given me a shot before he started the procedure. When it was over, he gave me another shot. The next thing I remember, I was with my grandparents again in Tucson, Arizona. I was 4 years old. You can see from this experiment that Dr. Green used trauma, drugs, post-hypnotic suggestion, and more trauma in an effort to gain total control of my mind. He used me in radiation experiments both for the purposes of determining the effects of radiation on various parts of my body and to terrorize me as an additional trauma in the mind control experiments. The rest of the experiments took place in Tucson, Arizona, out in the desert. I was taught how to pick locks, be secretive, use my photographic memory, and a technique to withhold information by repeating numbers to myself. Dr. Green moved on to wanting me to kill dolls that looked like real children. I stabbed a doll with a spear once after being severely traumatized, but the next time I refused. He used many pain induction techniques, but as I got older, I resisted more and more. He often tied me down in a cage, which was near his office. Between 1972 and 1976, he and his assistants were sometimes careless and left the cage unlocked. Whenever physically possible, I snuck into his office and found files with reports and memos addressed to CIA and military personnel. Included in these files were project, subproject, subject, and experiment names with some code numbers for radiation and mind control experiments, which I have submitted in your written documentation. I was caught twice, and Dr. Green ruthlessly used electric shock, drugs, spun me on a table, put shots in my stomach, in my back, dislocated my joints, and hypnotic techniques to make me feel crazy and suicidal. Because of my rebellion and growing lack of cooperation, they gave up on me as a spy assassin. Consequently, the last 2 years, 1974 to 1976, Dr. Green used various mind control techniques to reverse the spy assassin messages to self-destruct and death messages. His purpose? He wanted me dead, and I struggled to stay alive all of my adult life. I believe it is by the grace of God that I am still alive. These horrible experiments have profoundly affected my life. I developed multiple personality disorder because Dr. Green's goal was to split my mind into as many parts as possible so he could control me totally. He failed, but I've had to endure years of constant physical, mental, and emotional pain, even to this day. I've been in therapy consistently for 12 years, and it wasn't until I found my current therapist 2.5 years ago, who had knowledge of the mind control experiments, that I've finally been able to make real progress and begin to heal. In closing, I ask that you keep in mind that the memories I've described are but a glimpse of the countless others that took place over the 10 years between 1966 and 1976. That they weren't just radiation, but mind control and drug experiments as well. I have included more detailed information of what I remember in your written documentation. Please help us by recommending an investigation and making the information available so that therapists and other mental health professionals can help more people like myself. I know I can get better. I am getting better. And I know others can too, with the proper help. Please help us in an effort to prevent these heinous acts from continuing in the future. Thank you very much.
Between the years of 1957 and 1984, I became a pawn in a government scheme whose ultimate goal was mind control and to create the perfect spy, all through the use of chemicals, radiation, drugs, hypnosis, electric shock, isolation in tubs of water, sleep deprivation, brainwashing, verbal, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. I was exploited unwittingly for nearly 3 decades of my life, and the only explanations given to me were that, quote, the end justifies the means, and, quote, I was serving my country in their bold effort to fight communism. I can only summarize my circumstances by saying they took an already abused 7-year-old child and compounded my suffering beyond belief. The saddest part is, I know for a fact that I was not alone. There were countless other children in my same situation, and there was no one to help us until now. I've already submitted as much information as possible, including conversations overheard of the people, agencies responsible. I'm able to report all this to you in such detail because of my photographic memory and the arrogance of the doctors, the arrogance of the people involved. They were certain they would always control my mind. Although the process of recalling these atrocities is not an easy one, nor is it without some danger to myself and my family, I feel the risk is worth taking. Dr. L. Wilson Green, who claimed to have received $50 million from the Edgewood Chemical and Radiology Laboratory as part of the TSD, or Technical Science Division of the CIA, once described to Dr. Charles Brown that, quote, children were used as subjects because they were more fun to work with and cheaper too. They needed lower profile subjects than soldiers or government people. so only young, willing females would do. Besides, he said, I like scaring them. They in the agency think I'm a god, creating subjects experiments for whatever deviant purposes Sid and James can think up. Sid being Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, James, Dr. James Hamilton. In 1958, I was to be tested, they told me, by some important doctors from the society, or the Human Ecology Society, and I was instructed to cooperate. I was told not to look at anyone's faces and not try hard not to ignore any names, as this was a very secret project. But I was told to be brave, and all these things would help me forget. Naturally, as most children do, I did the opposite and remembered as much as I could. Dr. John Gittinger tested me, Dr. Cameron gave me the shocks, and Dr. Green the x-rays. Then I was told by Sid Gottlieb that, quote, I was right for the big A, or meaning artichoke. By the time I left to go home, just like every time from then on, I would remember only whatever explanations Dr. Robert G. Heath at Tulane Medical University gave me for the odd bruises, needle marks, burns on my head, fingers, and even the genital soreness. I had no reason to believe otherwise. They had already begun to control my mind. The next year, I was sent to a lodge in Maryland called Deep Creek Cabins to learn how to sexually please men. I was taught how to coerce them into talking about themselves, and it was Richard Helms, who was deputy director of the CIA, Dr. Gottlieb, Captain George White, Morris Allen, who all planned on filming as many high government agency officials and heads of academic institutions and foundations as possible, so that later when the funding for mind control and radiation started to dwindle, projects would continue. I was used to entrap many unwitting men, including themselves, all with the use of a hidden camera. I was only 9 years old when this sexual humiliation began. I overheard conversations about a part of the agency called ORD, which I found out was Office of Research and Development. It was run by Dr. Green, Dr. Stephen Aldrich, Martin Orne, and Morris Allen. Once a crude remark was made by Dr. Gottlieb about a certain possible leak over New Orleans East involving a large group of retarded children who are being given massive doses of radiation. He asked, why was Wilson so worried about a few retarded kids? After all, they would be the least likely to spill the beans. Another time, I heard Dr. Martin Orne, who was the director then of the scientific office and later the head of the Institute for Experimental Research, state that, quote, in order to keep more funding coming from different sources for radiation and mind control projects, he suggested stepping up the amounts of stressors used and also the blackmail portion of the experiments. He said it needed to be done faster than to get rid of the subjects, or they were asking for us to come back later and haunt them with our remembrances. There's much more I could tell you about government-sponsored research, including project names, sub-project numbers, people involved, facilities used, tests, and other forms of pain induction. But I think I've given more than enough information to recommend further investigation of all the mind control projects, especially as they involve so much use of the radiation. I would love nothing more than to say that I dreamed all this up and need just to forget it. But that would be a tragic mistake. It would also be a lie. All these atrocities did occur to me and to countless other children, and all under the guise of defending our country. It is because of the cumulative effects of exposure to radiation, chemicals, drugs, pain, and subsequent mental and physical distress that I've been robbed of the ability to work and even to bear any children of my own. It is blatantly obvious that none of this was needed, nor should it ever have been allowed to take place at all. And the only means we have to seek out the awful truth and bring it to light is by opening whatever files remain on all the projects and through another presidential commission on mind control. I believe that every citizen of this nation has the right to know just what is fact and what is fiction. It is our greatest protection against the possibility of this ever happening again. In conclusion, I can offer you no more than what I've given you today, the truth. And I thank you for your time.
I was given a glass of Kool-Aid, and so were the other children. This Kool-Aid was spiked with LSD. It was horrible. I was having trouble with my parents. My father and my stepmother decided to put me in the Allen Memorial Institute. They had no idea what went on in there. I was 16 when I was there. That was beside my bed constantly, repeated 250,000 and 500,000 times. Well, there's a lot I could not remember after I got out of the Allen. When my family came, I was a zombie. I didn't even know who they were. I am on medication now because of what happened to me when I was 16. I have not had any compensation or apology. I want everyone to know in Canada what went on in that horrible, horrible hospital.
My father was a victim of Dr. Cameron. He was a 27-year-old, healthy skier, canoeer, very athletic, and he had asthma. They told him if he went to the Allen Memorial, they could cure his asthma. He also was put in an insulin coma for 36 days with a recording beside him saying that your mother hates you over and over and over and over and over. He received 54 high voltage shock treatments, followed by 54 grand mal seizures. He never came out the same. He had a blank look in his eye. He didn't know who we were. He didn't know we were his daughters. He lost his job. We went into poverty after he came out. They all were behind it. They all knew what they were doing, but they weren't doing it out of care or love. They were doing it out of military and political reasons.
My father, Charles, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. He had a trigeminal neuralgia, it's called, where there's a pain in the temple that radiates into the jaw that apparently is excruciatingly painful. They told him that it was psychosomatic, which it's not, but in those days, what did they know? So they sent him to a shrink. This shrink that he went to was working with Cameron, although we didn't know. So he put my father right into the program. They immediately put him on insulin to put him into like an insulin coma. They took clips from the interview with the shrink and put it on tape to run a loop under his pillow while he was put into this sleep treatment. Russell shock treatment is approximately 40 to 75 times the strength of a normal shock treatment. So it's really designed to wipe out the memory. After 27 days of this, they said that they were discouraged because he still had ties to his former life, in that he was asking to see his wife. They decided to give him more Page Russell shock treatments and put him to sleep for another 30 days. He had said in his interview with the shrink that I was the apple of his eye. And after he came home, he started beating me not long after.
Thinking that, they would be helped. Little knowing that Dr. Cameron's goal was to depattern them, to wipe out their memory. No one signed to be experimented on. Nobody.
Eventually, some of his patients from the 50s and 60s received some compensation from the CIA and the federal government. But Marlene's family was told they didn't qualify because her aunt was a patient before the funding began.
That right away triggered anger in me and resentment. Why she refused? I want people to know that this was happening long before 1950.
Phyllis Goldberg was 19 when her uncle and sister admitted her to the Allen Memorial Institute. She was studying to be a nurse and started suffering from depression.
My uncle, especially being a physician, felt, wow, she's going to get the best care. She's going to see a world-class, up-and-coming, psychiatrist that's going to help her.
Instead, this is what she received. Her 1948 medical records show 9 electroshock treatments and 28 sleep-induced comas in less than a month.
She could not live a normal life. She could not get married. She could not have children. She was deprived of all those things. Her only pleasure in life was eating candy. She was reduced like I said, down to a child.
Her condition continued to worsen after her release. By the age of 60, she could no longer speak or even move. She passed away at 86.
And every time I put my hand on her head, she would cringe. And I didn't understand until I realized because of the electric shock treatment that was put on their heads and for the deprivation, sensory deprivation, that she had to wear all these headphones.
The family has been searching for answers, unable to even access most of her medical records. Told by the Royal Victoria Hospital until recently that the records were impossible to find.
You become suspicious. Why can't you find these files? Why are they keeping them?
Tomorrow, a look at Marlene's decades-old fight to hold those responsible accountable for their actions.
I've tried to lay it to rest, but there's always something that comes back to remind me I can't stop.
For City News in Montreal, I'm Tina Teneriello.
Thank you for watching part 1 of this 2-part series. In part 2, we're going to dive into more of the nitty-gritty behind the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk project, because there is a lot. So I really had to split it up into 2 parts. I was going to try to split it up into 3, but there's just no good stopping point for 3 parts. At least I don't think so. But let me know what you guys think so far. Let me know if I missed anything, or if there's a correction to anything, or maybe you have more information about some of the stuff I was talking about. So please, please, please leave all of that in the comment section below, because I am so invested in all of this, and if I miss something, I really want to read about it. Even just for myself, not even just to correct my video, but just to kind of read it for myself. But anyway, I'm rambling. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys next time, and this is Monica reporting to you live from a highway. Bye!